Afternoon and welcome. I'm Ken Weinstein, President and CEO of Hudson Institute. I'd like to welcome you to today's discussion on the current U.S. boom in unconventional oil and gas development. Today's U.S. energy policy could be viewed as a tale of two revolutions. On the one hand, as we all know, President Obama proposes to use the power of government to direct a revolutionary shift, a future revolutionary shift, I should add, away from the country's long-term reliance on fossil fuels. On the other hand, the United States and Canada are clearly both making a revolution here and now, and one that is seemingly in the exact opposite direction. That is, they are rapidly developing their huge reserves of unconventional oil and gas. In the United States, the central driver of this revolution is, without question, the boom in shale gas. Yet, like all past booms, the shale gas revolution has triggered an array of unwanted side effects. And the suddenness with which it has emerged has, if anything, exacerbated both the problems and our awareness of them. Governments, both state and federal, have been scrambling to respond. As they have, an old problem in U.S. government has resurfaced. How should state and federal authorities divide the work of curbing harmful side effects? The congressional bills, sometimes known as the FRAC Act bills, bring this question into sharp relief. But some observers think that the issue may also soon arise in other guises as well. The question of how to manage this division of labor between regulators at the state and federal level is at the heart of today's discussion. We have a very knowledgeable panel with us today to explore these questions. Hudson Institute visiting fellow Lee Lane will open the discussion by presenting a summary of his new report, Institutional Choices for Regulating Oil and Gas Wells. Natalie Toey, Principal Analyst at the Congressional Budget Office, will then follow. Krista Muth, Hudson Institute Distinguished Fellow, will close out the opening remarks. We'll then open the discussion to comments and questions from the floor. And the first person, as I said, we'll hear from is the principal author of the new study that is out today, Institutional Choices for Regulating Oil and Gas Wells, and I urge you to look it up on the Hudson Institute website, www.hudson.org, and we'll hear from our visiting fellow, Lee Lane, who has a long and distinguished career in the energy sector in many capacities, including railroads, dealing with climate policy, and the like. Lee.
Thanks a lot, Ken. I appreciate it very much, and thank all of you for your interest today. I don't know if any of you watched or were at the hearing this morning of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, actually on this same subject. But the hearing, I thought, brought out to a considerable degree the same observation that Ken just made about the seemingly conflicting visions of U.S. energy policy at the moment, between, on the one hand, the desire to move very rapidly away from the U.S. involvement in fossil energy, independence on fossil energy, and on the other hand, the actual facts in the energy sector, which seem to move in the opposite direction. To try to start our discussion on a note of some harmony, we may not keep that, I would point out that historically, energy revolutions, that is to say, real fundamental changes in global energy systems, have been a very, very long-term process. And if this change, or if the change that Mr. Obama wants to effect is like the historical pattern, we're probably looking at about a century-long transition, or maybe slightly shorter than that. And if that's the case, then the United States and the world are going to burn a lot of fossil fuel between now and the time when that energy transition is complete. So it may be that the conflict that is certainly evident in a lot of the rhetoric in the public discourse might in practice not be as sharp as initially one might think it would be. Certainly, in any case, the United States stands to gain enormously from the development of its resources in unconventional oil and gas, and especially the shale gas revolution that is currently in its appears to be currently in its early stages. I've seen estimates, probably some of you have seen others, but the ones I've seen suggest that by 2035 or so, shale gas alone may be adding $100 billion to $230 billion a year to U.S. GDP. Significant gains in terms of trade, very widely dispersed benefits, a lot of states producing shale gas, a clear advantage from the standpoint of U.S. manufacturing. Certainly the possibility, I would say the likelihood of strategic gains in terms of eliminating, or if not eliminating, probably more accurately, postponing the need for large-scale LNG imports that would come in all likelihood from countries that might not be entirely friendly to the United States. So there isn't much doubt, I think, that there are significant benefits to be derived from the development of U.S. unconventional oil and gas resources. Nevertheless, it's also clear that the boom that we are experiencing has, like I think pretty much every economic boom with which I am familiar, also generated a significant range of environmental costs and neighborhood effects and problems that of adjustment that are as widespread as the resources are, and therefore represent a significant source of political resistance and backlash, and are quite seriously a set of social problems. It seems clear to me that the regulatory structures at both the federal and the state level were not up to the speed of the economic revolution that's been developing. That regulatory lag has caused a number of problems. It's also clear that the regulatory institutions are scrambling very hard to catch up. And in the course of doing that, there has, as Ken just mentioned, there has developed a really interesting set of issues about what the proper division of labor is between the federal government and the state governments as far as the regulation of the production of these new resources is. And one of the manifestations of that, but only one manifestation, is the bills, the FRAC Act bills that have been introduced in both of the last two Congresses, bills that would expand EPA's regulatory capability over hydrofracking of oil and gas wells, significantly expand them, require a mandatory disclosure of the chemicals used in hydrofracking, and also, I think, less commonly recognized but potentially quite important, enable citizen suits under the Safe Drinking Water Act in ways that might interfere in surprising ways, unanticipated ways, with the process of developing the resource base. It is really the larger issue there, the division of labor between states and the federal government, that is the focal point of my recent work on this subject. And interestingly enough, as I got more into this subject, I discovered that the concerns that I had about the expansion of federal authority and the preemption that that some were advocating the federal government make were not in any sense, new issues. On the contrary, there has been a fairly substantial environmental economics literature about federalism as applied to issues of this kind. And without going through all of a list of all the studies, although there are actually references in the paper to a number of prior studies on this subject, it seemed to me that there were 4 tests that were widely agreed upon as being keys to whether and where federal preemption was merited and where it might not be. And so the first thing I want to do now is just run very quickly through those 4 widely cited tests and to see how well or poorly they apply in the case of the proposed federal regulation of hydrofracking as envisioned by the FRAC Acts, those bills in the Congress, but also more broadly to perhaps suggest some general principles for where the federal government should be taking a preeminent role and where it really would be more efficient, economically efficient, to leave responsibility to the states. So the first test, the one that I think is most generally accepted, is, are there significant trans-border impacts? That is to say, are activities that are taking place within the boundaries of one state causing major harm in states, in other states, so that one might suspect that the state in which the problems are originating might exert less than an optimal amount of spend less than an optimal amount of resources in controlling the problem. Well, there certainly are some problems associated with unconventional natural gas development that are like that. I would say fugitive methane emissions are a case that is very much of that type. But it does not appear, on the basis of the evidence that I was able to find, that the contamination by hydrofracturing fluids of underground drinking water sources is a problem that has been shown to be significant in the first place, and it certainly hasn't proven to be the case that there is any body of evidence showing that there are trans-border effects at this point. And so, from the standpoint of the first and the most obvious of those tests for federal preemption, it just doesn't seem to me as though there's any evidence suggesting that there is a grounds for preemption at all. The second case that is principle that is widely cited as grounds for preemption is whether the regulated industry manifests very strong economies, network economies or economies of scale. You really don't want a variety of state regulatory systems governing a unified network like a railroad industry, or governing a manufacturing industry like automobiles where there are very large economies of scale. But that case too doesn't really seem to apply to the exploration and production phase of oil and gas development. There may be economies of scale, but the fact that the industry is so diverse and there are so many small firms that seem to operate perfectly adequately suggests that those economies of scale are limited, and there really isn't the kind of network or scale economies that make uniform national regulation much more efficient in the case of other industries. So the third test is, are there reasons to believe that a central regulatory body would have superior information rather than dispersed regulation on the part of smaller jurisdictions that are closer to the actual problems. And in the case of oil and gas development, shale plays in particular, from what I read, I'm no geologist certainly, but the conditions differ so much from one shale basin to another that there just doesn't seem to be a very large advantage to have, indeed, it's more than there is not a large advantage to having a single regulatory system. It's hard to imagine a single regulatory system actually applying across such diverse circumstances. Think about it. I mean, water law differs from state to state, or at least from region to region. The geology differs, climate differs, even the makeup of the local industries as far as the mix between large and small firms and so forth differ. The regulatory laws differ, the regulatory agencies differ. It's just really not a case in which there appears to be a great advantage from having a single regulation governing all of these disparate cases. And ultimately, I think there's a problem here of, if there were a single regulation, since conditions are so disparate, anything, even were it by magic to be right on average, would still end up being not optimal in most specific cases. And in all probability, there would be significant inefficiencies associated with having a single system. So, I have long suspected that the environmental movement believes that it does better politically at the federal level than it does at the state level. And I suspect, as a political judgment, that may well be correct. But if we ask ourselves about the fourth criterion here for dividing labor between the feds and the states, is there some reason for thinking that the states systematically do less well in protecting the public interest than the federal government would? Again, I don't see any evidence for that being the case. The standard argument here is that state agencies might be more subject to regulatory capture. Having worked in the railroad industry, I've seen regulatory capture at the federal level as well. It was a long time ago, and it didn't last, but I don't see any reason for thinking that federal regulatory agencies are not susceptible to capture. And furthermore, regulatory capture is by no means the only, or perhaps not even the worst, fault in regulatory systems in terms of failing to protect the public interest versus achieving other goals. Sunstein and Curran have a paper back from the late 1990s in which they describe a long series of what we might think of as contagious panics in which regulatory systems were pushed into what were really irrational and unneeded regulations that then proved to be almost impossible to change. The examples they cited included Love Canal and ALAR, and they had a number of others, asbestos in schools and so forth. But nuclear power, it seems to me, represents exactly the same kind of phenomenon. As I say, a contagious panic which ends up being institutionalized in regulatory practice and then is very difficult to change. Taking those four factors together, I would conclude that, and did conclude, that there are aspects of shale gas development, like fugitive methane emissions, that may well justify federal regulation. I don't think a single rule applies as to whether regulation should be federal or state. But in the case of the specific problem proposed to be dealt with by the FRAC Acts, there just doesn't seem to be any solid case. Having said that, it seems to me that there are other potential roles for the federal government to play. One of those might be to provide small amounts of federal assistance to improve the technical quality of state-level regulation. I know that the OE has at least proposed making a small grant to Stronger as an effort in that direction, and that seems like a perfectly sensible thing to be thinking about. Another possibility, it seems to me, is federal R&D directed at reducing some of the environmental fears and environmental problems that are associated with hydraulic fracturing. And we have had regulatory programs like that in the past, and it seems to me that that might be a very useful role for the federal government to play. I should note that I have long been I notice Bob Marley sitting in the front of the audience. I've been both a friend in some ways and a critic of DOE's funding of research and development in the area of the environment, and I think it's a complicated question how we organize such federal R&D funding, but it's a subject where there does seem to me to be a positive role for the federal government to play, and a much more positive role than some of the regulatory proposals that we've seen recently. So, having said all those things, I nonetheless doubt very much that considerations of the economically efficient division of labor between the states and the feds will cause the cessation of federal proposals to regulate hydraulic fracturing. The fact is, and we all know this to be the case, that there are strong political incentives for the federal government to assert control over this economic activity. It's extremely valuable. Controlling the regulation over any major asset of oil and gas development is a political asset of considerable value. It can be a very useful source of headlines for the legislator who has such control, and it can also translate into a source of campaign contributions. And therefore, as a valuable asset, it will be contested, and I think we're seeing the result of that. The second thing that I think is at work here is a systematic error in the way we talk about public policy that was pointed out a long time ago by an economist named Harold Demsetz, who called it the Nirvana Fallacy. And what Demsetz meant was that we often, in discussing regulation, and environmental problems are not the only example of this, but they're a very, very common one. We very often have people say, well, let's look at an existing market or an existing regulatory system, and it turns out to be flawed. And at least it's flawed in comparison with a conjectured ideal regulatory system in which there aren't agency problems and knowledge is free and widely available, and institutions work without friction. But that isn't the way any actual regulatory system works. And what Demsetz argued was that what you really need to do is to compare the existing regulatory system with what is likely to actually be the regulatory system that you might possibly replace it with. And when you do that, in the case of federal preemption with regard to oil and gas, unconventional oil and gas exploration and production, I think you've got to be aware of three significant factors that are likely to lead any new system to be much less than ideal. The first of those factors is just simply think about our environmental statutes. None of them was drafted with economic efficiency as a major goal, and they all fall far short of having the kind of provisions that you would expect from an efficiency-centered statute. Secondly, think about the existing political environment, in which the Environmental Protection Agency is a highly polarized and polarizing agency. I know we have some EPA people toward the back of the room, and I hope that they would agree with me that the political polarization around EPA is very strong on ideological or philosophical grounds, and also on partisan grounds. We have a divided government, and we are likely to be moving into a period of fiscal stringency. If you put all of those things together, I think that a significant increase in EPA's responsibilities is likely not to be supported by a significant increase in regulatory resources, and that combination is a model for the same kind of problems that we had in the late 1980s with the Safe Drinking Water Act, in which the regulatory system is charged with doing all sorts of things that it can't actually do. And the last thing I would mention is that anything under the existing statutes that opens up the process of regulation to citizen suits also opens the possibility of the use of litigation for purely obstructionist purposes. And some of the statements, open statements by environmental groups in the United States suggesting that they are simply opposed to the use of fossil fuels and are trying to stop the development of unconventional gas if they can do so, suggest that the motivation is there. One last point, and I will then end, is just a basic reason for caution. It's my version of the precautionary principle. The U.S. government, its institutions, its checks and balances, is a system with many, many veto points. In a lot of respects, that's an absolutely wonderful system. I think it prevents us from making a lot of mistakes. But it also means that when a regulatory system is put in place, it becomes extremely difficult to repeal or to reform. And hence, there ought to be a very significant burden of proof on anyone who's proposing a new regulatory system. And it's not the sort of decision we ought to make unless there is an absolutely clear-cut case for the need of it. So, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Lee, for that very clear analytic framework by which we could place into balance the potential benefits of the FRAC Act and other federal efforts at potentially regulating fracking. We'll now hear from our two commentators. First, we'll hear from Natalie Toey, who is a principal analyst at the Congressional Budget Office's Macroeconomic Studies Division. She joined that division after getting her PhD in economics from MIT. She has published in leading economic and regulatory journals, and her work at the Congressional Budget Office includes publications on environmental federalism, emissions trading programs, financial assurances for environmental restoration, water resources, carbon sequestration and offsets, and deforestation. So we're fortunate to have her with us here today.
Thank you. Well, the first thing I want to do is apologize if I held up the start. I'm actually notorious for being really early, so this is an unusual day for me. So I apologize. Secondly, I did get a chance to look briefly at the hearing that Lee mentioned that was going on this morning in the Senate, and it was very interesting because if you think about the principles that Lee laid out, people sort of draw on the decision-making principles that he talked about, but in a very random fashion. And so you can throw up examples of things that seem to fit into one category or seem to fit into another, but you don't really get sort of a coherent, straightforward analytical approach to what are the questions, what are the answers. People are sort of picking and choosing to make their own points. So a number of years ago, CBO started to think about these questions of environmental federalism. And we tried to develop sort of an analytical framework that we hope could be applied to these questions in any context. And in some sense, it's very much along the lines of what Lee was talking about, but it breaks things up a little more specifically into different types of areas that you might want to think about who should be responsible for. And it also tries to delve a little bit into the complexities of, you know, the answer might seem like it's A, but what other things might make you think it's B instead. So what I'd like to do briefly is to go through the framework for you, which hopefully will be easy to keep in your mind because it's very much along the lines of what Lee was talking about, and then talk about how we applied it to 2 different case studies. And that will sort of, I hope, give you sort of a real world example of sort of that applying these frameworks, even though they seem pretty straightforward, can involve some complexities and subtleties that make them a little more difficult to draw straightforward conclusions from. And I should say that CBO has not applied this framework to hydraulic fracturing, which is a relatively new issue. But I think it would be very interesting to even expand on what Lee has done, sort of in a careful way, because as he mentioned, there are many environmental issues that people have raised concern about associated with hydraulic fracturing, or I guess one would say the development of shale-based resources generally. So in these different contexts, I imagine that these principles might give you different answers, as Lee pointed out. So I'm going to put on my glasses and launch right in. So CBO's framework was sort of broken down into 3 main questions. And keep in mind that what we're asking the question is, you know, what level of government is most likely to make decisions that balance the costs and benefits, all the relevant costs and benefits of a regulatory decision. And we think there are sort of 3 main areas that come into play here. One is choosing the standard, what should be the environmental standard that you want to apply to the situation. The second is selecting the method of control. How are you going to control emissions or activities to achieve that standard? And the third is determining and funding the basic research agenda that surround answering questions about the environmental impacts of this activity. And as I go through these, I think you'll see that they speak to a lot of the principles that Lee highlighted in his paper. So first, if we think about which is the appropriate level of government for choosing the standard, as Lee pointed out, the main question here is, do the costs and benefits of setting this standard extend beyond the state boundaries? And if they do, then there's a stronger rationale, of course, to have the federal government involved. But there are counter considerations which may argue against having the federal government involved. First, which level of government has the most information about those underlying costs and benefits? Second is another thing that Lee brought up. What are the objectives and also the capabilities of different levels of government? Do we know that they are weighing the relevant costs and benefits? Do we know that they are capable or have the information or the regulatory structure to develop appropriate standards? And thirdly, which is a minor consideration, but in certain situations I guess could be important, does centralizing the standard setting authority somehow yield savings in administrative costs that would argue for a federal role? So some of these things can either confirm that the federal role is important when you have cross-state effects, and some of them might argue against mitigating that federal role. The second area I mentioned was selecting the methods of control to achieve the given standard. And again, the same question comes up as the primary question. Do the opportunities and costs of a type of control vary across areas? And if they do, then there's a stronger rationale for having a local or a state level determine what controls should be in place. But other considerations that might counter that, as I think Lee mentioned, are economies of scale. For instance, could you design a product that could be applied in a lot of different jurisdictions and sold in a lot of different jurisdictions to address achieving the standard that you want to achieve? And if that's true, you would want to take advantage of those scale economies. Secondly, does the selection of a certain type of control have an effect outside the state? And finally, again, are states or local governments able and willing to choose what would be the efficient method of control? And then, as I mentioned, the third area is who should be responsible for determining and funding research on the environmental question. Again, if many states face the same type of environmental problems, then there's a stronger rationale for having the federal government do that. They have a better understanding of the fact that we want to balance the costs of research and development against the benefits that would accrue to all states, whereas a given state would underinvest in research because they're only taking into account the benefits that their own state would achieve from investing in that research. And here I think maybe some of the organizations that Lee mentioned, like Stronger, are important because there are situations in which cooperative ventures between different levels of government, and maybe even sometimes involving the private sector, can be efficient ways of determining and funding research. So I just wanted to go through a couple of quick case studies trying to apply those principles in a real-world context, which I think also will point up Lee's comment about sort of, we have a lot of regulatory frameworks in place. So we're living in a real world, and we have to take into account sort of what the situation actually is as it stands. So the first case study, we applied these principles to questions of protecting drinking water. And the EPA selecting standards for drinking water contaminants. So in choosing the standard, with respect to the first question, do these pollutants have effects outside the state boundaries? It turns out that for drinking water pollutants, most costs and benefits of controlling the pollutants are local. And it's also the case that other of these principles argue against a strong federal role. Information is very relevant, and local or state level information is very relevant because the per household costs of treating drinking water vary greatly across localities, and primarily with the size of the drinking water treatment system. And secondly, preferences for levels of protection could differ in different communities. Secondly, local governments' objectives probably would be properly aligned with principles of economic efficiency. Because if we applied a uniform standard, we are going to be imposing additional costs on smaller systems, which cannot benefit from the large economies of scale that apply when you're treating drinking water. And so achieving the standards could be more expensive for those systems. And in fact, in this study that CBO did on environmental federalism, we estimated that the potential welfare loss associated with EPA's drinking water standard for adjusted gross alpha emitters ranged from $38 per household to $775 per household, depending on how big their water system was. So the federal role in setting drinking water standards may not be efficient. But there are some subtleties involved here, and it's interesting to note that the federal rules as they stand do actually speak to some of those efficiency concerns. For instance, when EPA sets standards, they're allowed to consider the costs and benefits to large systems, which serve most of the US population, and the costs and benefits to small systems. And since standards that pass an overall cost-benefit sense test nationwide may not be efficient for smaller systems, EPA is allowed to let smaller systems install affordable treatment technologies that may not achieve federal standards, but that they determine would be protective of public health. I don't know what that means, but on the other hand, it's true that these alternative treatment technologies, there are a lot of hurdles that have to be overcome before they can be widely applied. But the existence of that situation shows that there is some nod to the question of state and local determinations of what would be more efficient in their specific circumstances. And finally, another factor that could lead one to say, well, a federal role might have some justification in this situation is if you believe that the nation as a whole or the people as a whole place a very high value on having a uniform level of protection across the whole country. Now, this is a hard question to get at, but in our study, we compared sort of these losses that I just discussed associated with this drinking water standard with the value that you would place on avoiding a cancer case. And so it turns out if you used that as the standard for sort of caring about a uniform level of protection nationwide, you would need to be placing an extremely high value on having a uniform level of protection to justify these standards on an efficiency basis. So secondly would be who should select the method of control. And here I think in the drinking water case, the allocation of authority is generally pretty consistent with principles of economic efficiency. And it also speaks to something Lee brought up in his paper, which is it's important to take advantage or think about taking advantage of the strengths of different levels of government. So as I mentioned, the costs of control for drinking water vary across different areas. And there are no federal requirements for particular control technologies. In fact, water systems only have to get state level approval for the use of different technologies. And so one would think, okay, this is a better situation because they can take into account their local circumstances. Interestingly, though, a complication with that decentralized authority is that there were indications that states actually didn't necessarily have the capability of choosing efficient methods of control because they were very reluctant to approve the use of less conventional technologies. So this speaks to one of the criteria I brought up was a state capability level. And in fact, what happened was EPA then was required to provide an updated list of alternative treatment technologies that different sized water systems might use and indicate the conditions under which they might be effective. So it was sort of like helping the states exercise their rights to select control technologies, but making sure that they were capable of making those selections. And finally, we have determining and funding the research agenda. And here in drinking water, I think that the allocation authority is also generally consistent with the principles of economic efficiency. States are facing the same types of problems that might be associated with different contaminants. And EPA is primarily responsible for assessing the health effects of contaminants. And EPA sponsors the development and evaluation of different technologies, especially for small systems. And then along the lines of cooperative agreements, the federal government has provided funds to the private sector to research different treatment technologies. So I think in drinking water, you can see that sort of going through this framework can give you sort of your guiding principles and can also help you assess arguments that might contraindicate sort of what your main criteria might lead you to decide. And I think that that's helpful in sort of watching the hearing today when people are throwing out maybe secondary criteria as if they were primary criteria. It's nice to have a framework to apply to be able to evaluate those arguments. I could go into a second case study, but I don't want to bore you all. I think the point here is that these principles, I think having a very concrete framework for thinking about these issues and a concrete framework for assessing sort of the different pieces of information that people are throwing out in the public debate is really important to deciding sort of what your ultimate conclusion is going to be about which level of government is most efficient for regulating. And I think that, as I said before, there's just a wealth of really good questions in the area of hydraulic fracturing. and in the whole process of developing shale resources, that would be really interesting to ask these questions in detail in the particular context of existing regulations, and sorting out sort of how to think about these different principles. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalie, for those fascinating and insightful remarks. We're seeing a consensus emerge on the panel, and that'll be up to Chris Demuth either to break that consensus or stay with it. Chris Demuth is a distinguished fellow here at Hudson Institute. Chris has written with great authority and insight on energy and regulatory issues for more than 3 decades. He, of course, served as president of the American Enterprise Institute before joining Hudson, and he also, in a past life, served as director of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs at OMB, as well as executive director of the President Reagan's Regulatory Relief Task Force as well. So it's my pleasure to turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Ken. Hydraulic fracturing is a fascinating case study. Am I on?
Yeah, your mic is up. You're a little taller than.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. It is a pretty new set of technologies that have obviously just immense revolutionary potential for very, very large economic and social benefits. They present environmental issues that are genuine but relatively straightforward. Standards for casing, for spill prevention and response, wastewater recycling, groundwater monitoring. Many of these would be fairly routine matters of industry standards. There are issues there where public regulatory agencies ought to get involved. Most of them, however, are largely local and are being addressed. Some are federal, but the federal ones, such as the one that Lee mentioned, EPA already has authority, and in fact it is a matter that it does regulate. So there are these fairly, serious, straightforward engineering, environmental issues that need to be addressed, but they are encased politically between 2 very different sorts of matters. The first is local issues, which can be described as environmental, but actually they're pretty conventional zoning issues. They involve land use, congestion, amenity. They are the, if you look at the cover of Lee's report, if these folks just had put in a few years ago a big picture window in the family room, they'd probably be unhappy with what has happened. On the other hand, they've got a jungle gym in the backyard, and the kids probably think this is really cool. So you do get these intense issues at the local level, and they're particularly fraught because in a lot of areas the potential for drilling has now become manifest in fairly highly developed places where the farmers and the landowners came first. At the other extreme is highly ideological politics, where there are significant numbers of people and organizations that are opposed to economic growth of any kind, and in particular to the success of fossil fuel energy, and whom everybody knows are devoted to stopping these things, although they cannot say so up front. We know that these ideologies exist, and you can sometimes find that Lee quotes a statement on the Sierra Club website, but everybody knows what is going on there. So in this fascinating situation comes Lee, and his paper is it's a superb little study It sets out the economics of fracturing and the policy considerations when one is thinking about the right way to go about regulation in a very clear and meticulous way. And I think that his presentation and the points that Natalie made in hers give a very good sense of how to think seriously and in a balanced way about the institutional considerations. I think that Lee, in his mild-mannered, balanced way, gives the proposed FRAC Act too clear, but he's much too mild in his criticism of it. It's much too balanced. It really doesn't deserve that. Disclosure regulation, it sort of has this good government patina to it. We're all for transparency and what do you have to hide, and sunshine is the best disinfectant. But aside from areas such as food labeling, calorie labeling, things that people can make immediate use of, when it comes to trace elements of exotic chemicals or exotic sounding chemicals that have hyphens in monosyllabic words, and if you can get the word nucleotide or anything with nuke in it, that's even better. Nobody knows what to make of this information except for the trial lawyers. I mean, there have been lots of studies of disclosure regulation. That's how it works. And the FRAC Act is, in fact, an effort to deal with the circumstances I've just described, that we have a technology that is, in fact, while there's local opposition to particular units of it, has immense potential benefits, and this is not going to be stopped at the level of mass national ideological politics the way things are going. So you adopt a different strategy of coming in underneath and using our dysfunctional tort system as a means of throwing sand in the gears, slowing things down, ensnaring the process, and the disclosure plus citizen suits is a mechanism to do that. I think, though, that the institutions, well, I think that the FRAC Act is a real threat, and the use of the trial system to achieve ideological goals is pretty well-established practice in our politics. I do think that our institutions are actually functioning pretty well here, and that this case presents some pretty good opportunities. Lee mentions in his paper some of the state groups that are coordinating and promoting best practices, sharing information, doing some good work. I want to emphasize opportunities for two other groups. The first is the Environmental Protection Agency. Lee mentions the sort of hothouse environment that EPA works in. But I've spent some time after I read Lee's report going around the EPA website, and the agency's reports and website pages and so forth dealing with fracturing seem to me to be extraordinarily informative, balanced, really very, very good pieces of work, better than a lot of the other sites that I've seen on the subject from industry and other groups. If I was at EPA, I would be embarrassed that these three reports that began Lee's study came from the General Accounting Office. What's the General Accounting Office doing studying the groundwater effects of fracturing so far? I know it can work on anything it wants to, but EPA is doing some reports that aren't going to be coming out for years. This is such an important issue. it seems to me that it's one where EPA could really cover itself in glory, and it's already begun to do that. But it should be the national repository of disinterested, useful information and analysis of the environmental issues that fracturing presents, and what is being done to address them. Secondly, I think that there are good opportunities for industry here. Individual corporations tend too often to address these issues as in terms of press agentry, and we're really fine here. We got the best engineers, and we've got beautiful photographs of them, and we put them in our ads, and we really care. But industry could do better than that, and there's a website called FRAC Facts that I think is an industry alliance. That's a real step forward. It's got a lot of facts. It doesn't try to gloss over issues. It describes what is being done, and it's quite persuasive. If I were at FRAC Facts or at the industry groups, I would be a little bit more political and deal not only with the kind of serious but straightforward environmental issues that I think are at the heart of this, but also with the ideological threats. There is the Wikipedia site on hydraulic fracturing is very good, got a good engineering stuff, and then it refers you to the environmental risks of hydraulic fracturing page, which is highly ideological, which talks about these imminent horrible risks to the national health and physiognomy and psychology that are being covered up by industry, and it's written with just enough balance so it gets beyond the wiki editors. But if you read it, you see what's going on. And it's filled with all these little factoids. It seems to me that industry groups should have, in their kind of very, straightforward engineering Joe Friday manner, answers to all of these little reports that seep out that will get into the press, Matt Damon interviews and movies and that kind of thing. I think that industry should really take not only the serious engineering environmental issues head on, but also this ideological overlay that we know is here. Most of all, I think that this is an opportunity from where we are today to have a really good case study of excellent environmental policy where we've learned from past mistakes, and we provide an example of new high-tech environmental new and high-tech energy exploration and production that is smaller footprint, lower impact, and environmentally far more benign. Not that it doesn't present any such issues, but is far more benign than any that we have seen in the past, and that this proceeds permitting both the energy, the economic, and the environmental benefits to go hand in hand, encased in a much more serious and professional on the merits environmental policy than we've sometimes had in the past, but should aim to have a lot more of in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for those characteristically insightful remarks. I agree with you, Jack Webb over Matt Damon any day of the week, and nice to hear you praise EPA for what you're criticizing Lee for, being mild-mannered and balanced. But that being said, let's open it up to questions from the audience, and we can also take questions from our viewers online at hudson.org, or at Hudson Institute, I apologize. Questions?
Hans Kuttner, Lee's Hudson colleague. So I caught on the idea that there's 23 states with some shale gas right now, and it suggested a model in my mind of, and possibly more in the future, given where the deposits are, that how much does the empirical reality match up with the model I have in my mind? And my model in my mind is that there's sort of A states and B states, and that the A states are those states with a lot of production. There's Colorado, Wyoming, North Dakota, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and then B states are states with not much production. And so there might be some heterogeneity in state type here, where there might be something that's appropriate for these A states going on their own, may not be appropriate with B states, because if there's sort of below some minimally efficient scale of regulatory stuff, that they might need something else. So that's a hypothesis which I now present to the panel for empirical investigation.
Well, Hans, I think there are clearly lots of differences in terms of the scale of production in the different states that have some production. I think the figure 23 states comes from an EIA report of a couple of years ago, and I wouldn't swear that it's still 23, but they got a table someplace, and you can see as you go down the list of the states that the levels of production differ dramatically from. So I think that's probably consistent with the idea. I don't know if it stratifies into two different levels as your mental model suggests, but there sure as hell are big differences in the level of output within states, and one would think that it probably isn't efficient for a state like, well, I'll just pick one out of the random California that doesn't have a lot of production at this point, to have anything like as elaborate a regulatory machinery as Texas or Pennsylvania. So to that extent, there's certainly the scale of production is another one of the many factors that causes the regulatory regimes within state or among states to differ quite dramatic. The optimal regulatory structures, I think, to vary quite a bit.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. I guess
Yes.
the things that pop to mind, just sort of from general reading about hydraulic fracturing.
Oh,
is,
your
you know,
mic's not on. Sorry, another button. Sorry.
Thank
It's on?
you.
Is it? Okay, sorry.
Are sort of what sort of question, to what environmental issue would we want to apply your question? So, you know, my understanding is there are sort of wastewater treatment issues associated with hydraulic fracturing. There are greenhouse gas issues associated with hydraulic fracturing. And at some point, sort of the level of regulation that you might want to apply might indeed depend on the scale of treatment. I mean, if you have not much wastewater to dispose of, then presumably issues associated with that might be less pressing than in areas where you have lots of wastewater to dispose of. Similarly, you might want to balance sort of what the resource demands are with the scale of, you know, I've heard people talk about, you know, are water use issues more pressing in drought-prone areas where you have hydraulic fracturing than they are in, you know, less drought-prone areas where. So again, sort of the one thing to think about might be sort of the interaction between sort of the resources used, the scale of the development, and also what that scale of development actually means for environmental impacts. In some cases, it might be significant even if the scale is small. In other cases, it might not.
Other questions in the back? Please
Is
identify yourself as well, and your organizational affiliation if you have one. Thank you.
I'm David Bardeen. I've been a state regulator and a federal regulator, and I've been a representative of private companies dealing with regulators. And I'm retired. And I don't work for anybody at the moment. The dichotomy of federal versus state troubles me, and I want you to, isn't it too simple as if it's just two? Aren't there various federal agencies which compete with each other, like Bureau of Land Management, EPA, President Obama may have been successful in his executive order last year to say, hey, get your acts together. I don't know whether he was. And in states, some states have one agency doing all the regulating. Others have two agencies. Now, everybody knows that oil and gas well drilling and stimulation and completion and plugging and abandoning and walking away from it poses all kinds of risks, serious risks. And you either deal with them or you don't deal with them. Is this really a separate issue for hydrofracking, or is it just convenient to get excited about it because of the dimension? But it's really true of all of the oil and gas wells that are drilled, certainly any ones which have any significant pressures, any significant technologies. My experience is that fracking has been going on for decades. What's new, I mean, is it used to be just 100 feet of play on a vertical well. Now you do these horizontal wells where you're fracking just about all at once, 2 miles worth of horizontal fracking. There's more water used, there's more sand used, there's more things. But aren't you guys, you economists, missing the fact that you have got to regulate? And all of the regulation that is command and control type regulation, with very few exceptions. And doesn't it have to be done? And it's understandable in terms of the last question. Yeah, if you're talking about New Jersey, I don't know that we in New Jersey have drilled a dozen oil wells in the last 100 years. But if you're talking about a state like Texas, it's going to look very different. Maybe the New Jerseyans would like the federal government to do it for them. So could you, are you really skipping, are you oversimplifying in your presentation?
Sure. Lee.
Yes, I think all of our comments are somewhat oversimplified. Certainly, the environment, the institutional environment, is a lot more complex than just a dichotomy between the federal level and the state level. I think you make a number of good points. Certainly, hydrofracturing is not a new technology. One of the things that makes this situation different is, well, actually there are three things that are important. First, the tremendous explosion in the volume of exploration and production that's going on. Second, the spread of those activities into many areas that were not accustomed to being the sites of that kind of activity in the past. And third, the fact that the development has been so rapid that I think regulatory agencies are suffering in a number of cases from regulatory lag. Having said all those things, it still seems to me that fundamentally we have a set of decisions to make about which level of government is best suited to handling individual aspects, or particular identifiable aspects of the environmental problems that are raised. I don't think anybody on this panel has suggested that there is no need for regulation. What we're talking about is where is that regulation most efficiently put. And I've suggested, and I think we've all come up with various formulations about principles to follow in locating where the regulation is likely to be done most efficiently for different kinds of problems.
Yeah, I would just agree with Lee. I mean, I think the reason there's so much attention on this, of course, is that the scale is increasing or potentially increasing very rapidly, that there's a lot of politicking around these issues, and there's also a lot of regulation going on. And I know that looking at different summaries of how different states are regulating these issues, you can see, states in different areas of regulating the hydraulic fracturing process have regulations that vary quite dramatically in terms of how strict they are. That might reflect sort of local preferences or local circumstances, or it might reflect sort of the catching up kind of thing that Lee was talking about. So I just think that people are paying a great amount of attention to the environmental impacts of fracking and how that might play into the development of the resource, which, as Lee mentioned, is a potentially a very big issue for our economy and our energy picture. So I think that's why those are the reasons why this is getting so much attention, and these questions are so important.
The situation that you describe is the situation that we have right now. The BLM's working on this, EPA's working on this, state agencies are working on this, and it looks like a cacophony from the top. But if you're down there at a particular site, there are the local zoning people and there are the state people, and depending on who owns the site, there are different regulatory authorities involved. But the question before the House is this not good enough, that we need to nationalize it? So it's not that Lee was kind of opposed to anything. There's a proposition that somebody's put on the table. We want to move the locus of regulation to the national level. It turns out that the only thing that has been proposed to date is this disclosure regulation. So it's not really regulation of the facilities in any direct sense. But because it is being proposed, and because it is being proposed of a technology that's growing so quickly, Lee took the occasion to look at the institutional questions. He's not saying somebody should do this, that, or the other thing. There's a lot of regulation by a lot of different agencies that is going on right now. And I take his conclusion to be that, in general, the current situation is adequate to the problems in terms of local, federal, state jurisdiction. It could be that all levels have some catching up to do, because this is new. Fracturing's been going on for a long time, but this particular technology is 10 years old now, 15 years old. So there's some catching up to do, but in his view, it does not present a crisis of insufficient nationalization of authority.
I would even suggest that nationalizing the authority has a considerable potential, and I think this is actually an important point to stress. It's got a considerable potential to make things worse. And that kind of leads directly to the thought with which I concluded my opening remarks. It's really important to be careful about this. There's a lot at stake, and injecting a new set of federal level regulations in the current institutional and political environment is something that is fraught with considerable risks.
Over here in the front.
Good afternoon. I'm Bill Holland. I'm a reporter with the Gas Daily. I have two questions, one kind of generic and philosophical. Is economic efficiency the proper tool with which to manage issues like this? I mean, we have a Clean Water Act. It may be inefficient. It may not be. I don't care. I got clean water. Safe Water Drinking Act, maybe it's not inefficient, maybe it's efficient. I don't really care. My drinking water is safe. We did have a period of time in this country where we did not have clean air and clean water. Those are public goods. Don't you run into the problem that has cursed economists since the art began, the public common?
My answer to that is a resounding no. Resources are scarce, and yes, clean air and clean water are public goods, but it really matters in the cost of achieving those public goods matters tremendously and can be very different depending upon how you structure the institutions for getting those public goods. And that's what we're really talking about here. It looks like there are potentially rather significant differences in costs depending upon the institutional arrangements you choose. And what I'm proposing is that there are significant improvements by choosing right as far as the level of control is concerned. That is to say, the level of government that is exerting the control.
Thank you. The second question is a little bit more specific, and it's actually very specific. It's a case in front of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Oil and gas industry has resisted federal regulation for reasons of their own, because they think it should be held at the localist level, and now they're resisting the ability of towns and counties to zone their businesses out of their town or county or city. There's a case going before the Pennsylvania Supreme Court on this issue. A set of towns south of Pittsburgh are suing the state because the state changed its law and made oil and gas law universal and preempted the zoning rights of communities. So you yourself mentioned that zoning is properly at the local level. So do you think there's an overreach here on the part of the state of Pennsylvania?
I haven't studied the case, and I think I'm going to decide not to comment on this because I just don't know the details well enough. But
Industries and trade groups are often philosophically inconsistent, and that's why we have think tanks. Good point.
Okay, next question. Yeah, Lee, let me ask you a question. You had mentioned that it was easier for environmental groups to capture state regulatory agencies. I was wondering, you mentioned it sort of in passing in your remarks, and I was wondering why that's not, why that is the case, and one might think it would be the opposite, that industry would have an advantage.
Actually, I probably misspoke, Ken. The environmentalists believe,
Okay.
and I think a lot of academics believe too, that industry finds it easier to capture regulatory agencies at the state level than it is at the federal level. I'm not sure that that's true, to tell you the truth. And I think in any case, our biggest regulatory problem is this propensity to allow uninformed and often panicky public opinion to prompt regulation that makes absolutely no economic sense or no risk management sense. And I'm not sure that that problem exists by any means more at the state and local level than it does at the federal level, where I think it's been a very prominent feature of regulatory politics.
I think that there's some of the things that you hear said on this issue are a little bit out of date. And I would disagree with one point in Lee's paper. He says that environmental policy is highly partisan and politicized. I actually think that environmental policy has been for 25 or 30 years a consensus issue where for 90% of the issues there's essentially no disagreement. That it is infected with highly ideological issues that sometimes find their way into partisan politics, but actually not even that much. I mean, EPA was created by Richard Nixon. If you look, you can look at a lot of partisan back and forth, but if you look at the progress of environmental policy and what EPA actually does from 1970 through the present, can't find that much difference from one party administration to another. So I don't want to deny that there are political differences in the way people argue about these things. I can imagine that in the 1960s, states would have insufficiently enforced some pollution control policies in an effort to attract industry. I do not believe that that's the case today because environmental issues are very, very strong. They get into the newspapers. People care about them a lot. You hear people talk about people attacking the bureaucrats and all the bad things that they're doing and destroying jobs. But but you got a real environmental issue that's out there, and the complaints go away. So I think that, so I would say that there's a very strong consensus, and that today tells me that whatever the merits were, and maybe it's irreversible, of nationalizing a lot of issues in the environment, safe drinking water, which is not entirely but largely an intrastate issue, and putting aside the questions of economies of scale, information, I would have no doubt that the states today possess very strong incentives to get safe drinking water to their constituents.
I mean, one thing that got omitted just for considerations of length from the final version of this report that had actually been in an earlier version was very much consistent with Chris's remarks, that I think much of the literature has come to conclude that as an empirical matter, the so-called race to the bottom problem, in which states were supposed to compete in degrading their environmental quality regulations in order to attract industry, it turns out just not empirically to be true, that there really is no real justification for the belief that that is a major problem. As to whether the environmental issues still have an ideological component or not, I don't know. I guess I'm not as convinced that there's as much consensus as Chris is suggesting, but it may just be that I'm projecting my own dislike of our use of command and control regulation in lots of inefficient ways.
The techniques of regulation are a different matter from whether environmental quality is a partisan football versus something that most people care about.
On that note, we'll have that as the final word because we're out of time. I just want to thank Lee Lane for a terrific paper. I also want to thank Natalie Toey and Krista Muth for excellent comments today. And lastly, I want to thank our communications team, Jamie Bologna and Perry Farbstein in particular, for working on today's events. Thank you very much. Our panelists will be here if you have questions for them as well. Thank you.